Welcome to WorldXplain. On July 19, 1989, a routine flight turned into a one-in-a-billion nightmare in the sky. Picture this: United Airlines Flight 232, a massive DC-10 carrying hundreds of passengers, is cruising peacefully under a beautiful, sunny Colorado sky. The autopilot is engaged, the cockpit is totally calm, but then, high above the Midwestern plains, a violent, deafening jolt suddenly rocks the entire aircraft. Alarm bells immediately start screaming, and in a matter of just seconds, the flight crew realizes they are facing a catastrophic failure that the aircraft's very own designers had deemed mathematically impossible.
1 in a billion. That was the estimated probability of what had just happened to Flight 232. The plane violently banked to the right, shuddering helplessly up in the sky. The co-pilot immediately grabs the control column, desperately fighting to level the wings, but nothing. The massive aircraft just didn't respond. The controls were completely dead. The flight engineer rapidly scanned his panels and delivered some absolutely blood-chilling news to the cockpit. The plane had lost all of its hydraulic fluid. Now, to truly understand why this is essentially a death sentence for a commercial airliner, we need to look at how these massive, heavy machines are actually steered.
Okay, let's dive into this. On a commercial jet, you aren't steering with cables and pulleys like you would in a tiny prop plane. You rely entirely on hydraulic fluid. You can think of this highly pressurized liquid as the actual muscle of the airplane. When a pilot turns the wheel left, that physical movement tells valves to push pressurized fluid against mechanisms that force the massive ailerons and rudders to push back against the howling wind. Without this fluid, you have zero pressure. So no matter how hard you yank on that control column, the plane will not respond. It's totally disconnected. Because this system is so absolutely vital for survival, a DC-10 is built with 3 completely separate independent hydraulic lines. The idea is, if one fails, you've got 2 backups ready to take over. Losing all 3 at once? That was supposed to be impossible. So how exactly does the impossible happen? Well, let's move to the rear of the plane and see how a tiny flaw built into a terrifying chain reaction. Deep inside the rear tail engine, a fan disc had been manufactured with microscopic impurities in the metal. Over years and years of flights, a tiny, completely undetected crack grew. And on July 19th, that metal disc finally reached its breaking point and shattered under immense rotational stress. The explosion inside that engine was so violent, it sent razor-sharp shrapnel tearing right through the tail section. And tragically, this shrapnel acting like a shotgun blast, slicing directly through the one exact choke point in the entire aircraft, where all 3 independent hydraulic lines converged. In a flash, all 3 lines were severed. The lifeblood of the airplane just bled out into the open sky. Now, while the pilots up front are wrestling with this dying aircraft, back in the cabin, a passenger sitting in first class stops a panicked flight attendant. He's remarkably calm, and he just asks for an update on what's going on. This was Fitch. He was an off-duty flight instructor specifically for the DC-10. When the attendant told them about the total hydraulic failure, a cold dread must have washed over him. He knew every single inch of this aircraft. He knew the 1 in a billion odds they were facing. But worst of all, he knew exactly what happens to an airplane when it loses all its hydraulics, because he had obsessively studied a doomed flight that suffered the exact same fate just 4 years earlier. Section 1. A doomed predecessor. Japan Airlines Flight 123. Let's step back in time for a moment. 4 years earlier, in August 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 took off from Tokyo. It was a Boeing 747 SR, which is a heavily modified variant specifically designed for short, high-demand domestic routes. To pack in as many people as possible, they reduced the business class size, allowing a staggering 524 people on board. It was just supposed to be a routine 1-hour jump to Osaka. But deep in the tail of this heavily loaded jumbo jet, a deadly mechanical failure was waiting to unleash pure horror. You see, the root of this disaster actually stretched back years to a hard landing that dragged the tail of the plane along the runway. When they fixed it, the repair work focused on the rear pressure bulkhead. That's the massive dome-shaped seal that keeps the pressurized cabin air from escaping into the unpressurized tail. But the engineers made a fatal error. Instead of using a single, continuous splice plate to connect the repaired metal sections, they took a shortcut and cut the plate into 2 separate pieces. Because of this, the top row of rivets carried absolutely zero load. Every single time that plane climbed and the cabin pressurized, the metal flexed and cracked, weakening the entire structure flight after flight, tick-tock, until it finally could no longer hold. Just 12 minutes into Flight 123, that weakened bulkhead violently ruptured. A massive explosive decompression blew out the back of the aircraft, the sheer, devastating force of the pressurized air rushing into the unpressurized tail section instantly blew the entire vertical tail fin right off the airplane. In less than half a second, the oxygen masks dropped, the cabin filled with a terrifying, blinding fog, and the flying shrapnel severed every single hydraulic line. In the blink of an eye, the pilots were left flying a colossal 747 with absolutely no flight controls and no tail fin. And this brilliantly illustrates the terrifying physical phenomenon that completely took over the aircraft: phugoid motion. With no tail fin to stabilize the plane and no elevators to control its pitch, the massive 747 became trapped in a sickening, uncontrollable wave. The nose would drop, sending the plane plunging into a steep dive. As it dove, it naturally gained speed, which then created massive lift, violently throwing the nose back up into the sky. It would climb higher and higher until it lost speed, stalled out, and plunged right back down again. The pilots were trapped in this horrifying, endless roller coaster in the sky, fighting desperately just to stay in the air. For an agonizing 30 minutes, the crew of Flight 123 fought a battle they simply could not win. They discovered they could slightly influence the plane's direction by increasing and decreasing the engine thrust, desperately trying to turn the crippled bird back toward Tokyo. But the phugoid motion was just overpowering. As they physically fought this rising and falling aircraft, they realized with growing horror that the plane was drifting inland, heading straight toward the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Japanese Alps. Despite their heroic, exhausting struggle, the mountains were completely unavoidable. The plane violently slammed into a mountain ridge. It was a catastrophic impact that instantly shattered the aircraft. Due to the incredibly remote location and approaching nightfall, rescuers actually deemed it unreachable. They assumed, tragically, that no one could possibly survive an impact like that. So they delayed the rescue operation until the following morning. But when they finally arrived 14 hours later, they miraculously found 4 survivors. The delay, however, was absolutely devastating. Doctors later determined that many more people had actually survived the initial impact, but succumbed to their injuries and the freezing mountain elements overnight. With 520 lives lost, it remains the deadliest single plane crash in human history. Section 2. Flying without controls. The return to United 232. Which brings us right back to the terrified cabin of United Flight 232, suspended high over the American Midwest. Flight instructor Denny Fitch, knowing exactly the grim history of JAL 123, stepped into the cockpit to help. He found Captain Alfred Haynes and the crew locked in a desperate physical struggle. The plane was constantly trying to bank to the right and flip completely over. With Fitch stepping up to the center console, these 4 men formed an ad hoc team to attempt the impossible, flying a completely dead airplane purely by engine power. To understand how they fought back, we really need to look at differential engine thrust. With the control column completely useless, Fitch knelt down on the floor between the pilots and took hold of the 2 remaining engine throttles. To turn the plane left, Fitch had to manually jam the right engine throttle forward while pulling the left engine back. He was using the asymmetrical thrust to physically twist the heavy aircraft through the sky. It was an exhausting, microscopic balancing act, requiring immense concentration just to keep the plane from flipping over into an unrecoverable death spiral. The initial hope, of course, was to make it to Chicago. But as they wrestled with this incredibly sluggish, crippled plane, Captain Haynes realized they just wouldn't make it. Over the crackling radio, he told air traffic control that if they couldn't find an airfield fast, they were going to literally drop out of the sky wherever they happened to be. Air traffic control frantically scanned their scopes and guided them toward the absolute closest possible runway they could find, Sioux City, Iowa. As the pilots aimed for Sioux City, the flight attendants prepared the cabin for a crash landing. And as they walked the aisles, they faced a truly heartbreaking reality. You see, it was Children's Day on United Airlines, a promotion where kids flew for just a penny. Because of this, there were 52 unaccompanied minors on board. For the tiny infants under 2 who didn't even have their own seats, the flight attendants had to instruct terrified parents to place their babies on the floor, surround them with pillows, and pray. Just imagine that. It was an agonizing, emotional atmosphere of impending doom as the ground rapidly rushed up to meet them. The approach to Sioux City was terrifyingly chaotic. Because the plane was constantly pulling hard to the right, the crew couldn't just fly in a straight line toward the airport. They had to corkscrew their way down in massive, dizzying right-hand loops. And to make matters even worse, without hydraulics, they couldn't lower the wing flaps. Flaps act like massive air brakes for an airplane. Without them, Flight 232 was coming in at a blistering 250 miles per hour. That is more than double the speed of a normal landing. They were essentially a heavy, fuel-laden missile hurtling directly toward the tarmac. Emerging from their final dizzying loop, the pilots realized they were completely misaligned for the main runway. Instead, they found themselves pointing perfectly at runway 22, which was a closed runway currently covered with emergency fire trucks waiting for them. Air traffic control frantically ordered the trucks to scatter just seconds before touchdown. With the ground screaming toward them at impossible speeds, Captain Haynes keyed the microphone to the cabin and delivered the final chilling command: brace, brace, brace. At the absolute last moment, the right wing dipped violently and struck the concrete. Flight 232 cartwheeled in a catastrophic fireball, breaking into massive, flaming pieces that violently skidded off the runway and deep into the adjacent cornfields. It was a horrific scene of destruction. While vastly different from the high-speed mountain impact of Japan Airlines 123, it was equally chaotic. Emergency responders rushing into those smoking cornfields braced themselves for total devastation, completely expecting another tragic loss of every single soul on board. But then, out of the thick black smoke and towering flames, an absolute miracle emerged. Passengers actually began to stumble out of the torn fuselage and into the sunlight. In one incredible act of bravery, a survivor even re-entered the burning wreckage after hearing a faint cry, pulling a baby to safety from a completely crushed overhead bin. Miraculously, out of the 296 people on board, an unbelievable 183 people survived, including all 4 men in the crushed, unrecognizable cockpit. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast it reveals when we compare these two impossible scenarios side by side. While both aircraft lost all hydraulics, United 232 had the immense advantage of flat, open planes and, crucially, an intact vertical stabilizer, which gave them just enough aerodynamic stability to even attempt a landing. Japan Airlines 123, entirely missing its tail fin and trapped over towering mountains, faced a physically impossible survival equation. Yet, despite the wildly different outcomes, both flights demonstrated an unbelievable level of human endurance and sheer willpower. This brings us to a really profound question. When faced with alarms screaming, controls completely dead, and hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, how does a flight crew actually manage the impossible? How did 4 men in the cockpit of Flight 232 avoid total panic, coordinate their actions flawlessly, and bring a completely unflyable metal tube down to an airport? Well, the answer lies in a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry trains its pilots. It's known as crew resource management, or CRM. You see, before the 1980s, the captain was essentially an unquestioned dictator in the cockpit. If he made a mistake, junior pilots were often way too intimidated to correct him, a cultural flaw that directly led to the horrific 1977 Tenerife disaster, where two 747s collided purely because of a breakdown in communication. CRM completely changed this. It taught crews to work as a unified, problem-solving team. And today, throughout this explainer, you've seen why United 232 is still taught as the absolute gold standard of CRM. The captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and the off-duty instructor completely abandoned their egos, shared every piece of data, and worked together as one single mind. The survival of 183 people in Sioux City wasn't just some mechanical anomaly. It was the ultimate triumph of human collaboration. The crew utilized every single ounce of their combined skill, leveraging an open line of flawless communication with each other and with air traffic control. And undeniably, they were blessed with a little bit of luck in their timing, the daylight, and the flat Midwestern terrain. They took a completely unsolvable equation and forcefully bent it towards survival. In a situation where survival is mathematically impossible, is it the engineering or the sheer human will to live that ultimately guides us to the ground? Thank you for watching World Explained. See you in the next video.